I never imagined grief could come with such cruelty. Losing my husband was already the kind of wound that split me open from the inside, leaving me raw, aching, and hollow. But what happened just days later, what my stepdaughter did to me, cut even deeper than death itself. It was a gray afternoon, the kind where the sky seemed undecided between rain and gloom when it happened. I had stepped outside for only a few minutes to get some fresh air, to clear the fog in my head after another morning of tear-soaked pillows and unanswered questions. My husband had always been the one who steadied me, the one who reached for my hand when the world felt too heavy. Now he was gone, and the silence inside that house we had built together pressed down on me like a weight I could not lift. When I turned the knob to go back inside, it didn't budge. Confused, I tried again, twisting harder this time. Locked. I knocked gently at first, thinking maybe it had jammed. "Hello?" I called, my voice breaking. "It's me." The sound of footsteps approached, and then the door swung open just a crack. Behind it stood my stepdaughter, Melissa, her face still lined with the traces of feigned sorrow she had worn at the funeral, now carried something colder, something triumphant. "You don't live here anymore," she said flatly, her hand gripping the edge of the door. I blinked, sure I had misheard. "What? What do you mean?" My voice trembled, even as I tried to sound steady. "This is my home. Your father and I—" "Was your home," she cut in, her lips curling into the faintest trace of a smirk. "Dad's gone now. And so are you. You have nothing left here." The words slammed into me like a fist. Nothing left? The walls behind her still held the family photos I'd helped hang. The kitchen inside still smelled faintly of the casserole I had cooked 2 nights before. My husband's slippers were by the fireplace, right where he'd last left them. Everything about that house screamed of the life we had shared, the life I had poured myself into. And she was telling me it was no longer mine? I tried to reason with her. "Melissa, I understand we're all grieving, but this isn't the time for—" Her laughter sliced through me like glass. It wasn't the nervous kind of laugh people let slip in times of discomfort. It was mocking, deliberate, cruel. "You really don't get it, do you? You don't own anything here. This house, this life, it's mine now. So why don't you save us both the drama and just leave?" I felt the blood drain from my face, my hand still clinging to the doorknob as though it could anchor me. This girl, this young woman I had once tucked into bed with warm cocoa on stormy nights, who I had hugged when her first boyfriend broke her heart, was now looking at me like I was an intruder, a nuisance, a leftover piece of furniture to be thrown to the curb. "Melissa," I whispered, searching her eyes for even a flicker of the child I once knew, but there was nothing, just cold determination. And then, as if twisting the knife deeper, she widened the door just enough to step forward, forcing me back onto the porch. "Goodbye," she said simply, and with that, she slammed the door shut. The final click of the lock echoed louder than thunder. I stood there, my chest tight, my pulse racing in disbelief. I wanted to pound on the door, to scream that she had no right, that this was my home as much as it had ever been hers. But the strength wouldn't come. Grief had already hollowed me out, and now humiliation piled on top of it. The chill of the air settled into my bones as I sank onto the porch steps, my hands trembling in my lap. All I had left were the clothes on my back, and the memories swirling like ghosts inside those walls. Memories that, for the moment, I had no access to. I remember whispering aloud, maybe to my husband, maybe to God. How could she do this to me? After everything? The house loomed behind me, silent and unyielding, while I sat outside like a stranger. Melissa thought she had won, that she had stripped me of everything. But what she didn't know, what even I didn't realize at that moment, was that my husband had left behind something she could never take away. Something waiting quietly, sealed in paper, ready to change everything. And though I didn't know it then, That locked door was not the end of my story. It was only the beginning. The night my world cracked open was so ordinary it almost feels insulting to call it tragic. We'd eaten late. Grilled chicken, a heap of green beans, the last of the cornbread from Sunday. My husband, Tom, had teased me about the way I scraped the browned bits from the skillet like they're gold. He kissed my forehead when I shooed him from the sink. "I married you for those browned bits," he said, smiling that slow smile that always softened the edges of my day. We watched the 10 o'clock news like we always did, his arm across the back of the couch, my feet tucked under a throw blanket I'd crocheted the winter we were broke and hopeful and newly married. He dozed off midway through a story about road construction on the interstate, snoring lightly, the way he did whenever he meant to protest that he wasn't tired. I nudged him. "Bed," I said. He grinned, stretched, and followed me down the hall, fingers tracing the doorway like he had to bless every room on the way. At 2:11 a.m., I jolted awake to a sound I can only describe as absence, the absence of the gentle rhythm of his breathing, replaced by a choking, awful silence. Then a gasp, a struggle. I turned on the lamp. "Tom?" His face was ashen, his eyes blown wide, his hand pressed to his chest like he could hold the pain still by sheer will. I called 911 with shaking fingers, my voice somewhere above me, calm and clipped, a stranger's voice telling the operator our address, the symptoms, the timing. I counted compressions out loud while the dispatcher counted with me, the numbers turning into a prayer I didn't know I remembered. The paramedics burst through the door, and I was ushered into the hallway, my robe tied wrong, my hands balled into fists I couldn't unclench. Hospitals at night feel like they're suspended in a separate world, too bright, too cold, too quiet, where time is a rumor and every face is a mask. By the time I finished signing papers I couldn't read, a doctor with kind eyes told me what the silence had already said. It was swift. It was severe. There was nothing more they could do. He said the words, "cardiac arrest," as if they were enough to explain how a life can evaporate between one breath and the next. I sat there on a plastic chair that squeaked when I moved, staring at my own knees like they belonged to someone else. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Eventually, the automatic doors opened and Melissa appeared, hair thrown into a careless knot, sweatshirt that probably cost more than any dress in my closet. She crossed the waiting room with a kind of hurried grace, mascara smudged under her eyes like ink stains. "Is he?" she asked, though I think she already knew. I nodded. Her shoulders fell forward, a small, contained collapse, and she folded into me. I held her, and for a moment we were two women suspended over the same chasm. "I'm so sorry," she whispered into my hair. I believed her. I wanted to. But then something shifted, so small I might have missed it if grief hadn't sharpened my senses. She pulled away, brushed invisible dust from her sleeves, and took over. "I'll talk to the doctor," she said. "We'll need the death certificate, and I should call Dad's boss. There's the mortgage, auto pay, and the utilities, and insurance. I'll handle the insurance. The word had weight the way some words do when they're more than letters. I filed it away without meaning to, the way you tuck a pin into fabric so it won't slide. Back home at dawn, the house wore the same clothes from the night before, socks abandoned beside the recliner, his reading glasses on the side table, condensation rings on the counter where his water glass had sweated. Melissa moved through the rooms like an event planner scouting a venue. Lists, phone calls, efficient nods, the cadence of someone in control. When I offered to call the funeral home, she waved me off gently. "You should rest," she said. "I'll take care of arrangements." Her tone was warm, but there was a finality to it, a closed door I hadn't tried yet. I wandered into the bedroom and found his shirt from yesterday draped across the chair. I pressed my face into the fabric, breathing in laundry soap and the faint spice of his aftershave, and let the soundless kind of cry shake me, the kind that empties you so thoroughly you feel hollowed out afterward. When I returned to the kitchen, Melissa had her laptop, open, a dozen tabs lined up like soldiers, Obituaries, florists, casket prices, a spreadsheet already populating with costs. She glanced up. "Mom," she started, and I went still at the word. She rarely used it. "We should keep this modest," she continued. "Dad hated pomp. Simple service, immediate family. I think that's best." "Of course," I said, "because what else do you say when your mouth is dry and your heart is pulp and someone is offering to carry a piece of the load?" The next 2 days blurred, casseroles from neighbors, the murmur of condolences, the rhythm of logistics. But beneath the busy hum ran another current, small looks between Melissa and a friend who came by to help, hushed conversations that paused when I entered the room, a call she took on the back porch with her voice pitched low and steady. Each time I told myself the same thing. People grieve differently. She needs to organize to survive this. I tried to be grateful that someone, was holding the scaffolding up while I floated. On the morning of the funeral, I found Melissa in Tom's office, the door half closed. She was riffling through a file drawer, her movements quick, clipped. When she noticed me, she smiled, too fast. "Just looking for Dad's employee contact list," she said, tapping a stack of papers. I nodded. The drawer clicked shut a heartbeat later, but I caught a glimpse of the brass key tray we kept on the shelf, only now it held one less key than yesterday. Strange, I thought, the way a missing shape can be louder than a sound. At the church, she was immaculate. Black dress, hands folded just right, the face of a woman who loved and lost. She spoke briefly about her father's sense of humor, the way he taught her to parallel park in the mall lot on Sunday mornings, and people dabbed their eyes. I did too. Afterward, at the reception, I overheard fragments of conversation, someone mentioning probate, someone else the phrase title transfer. Each snippet landed like a dull thud, a word I'd have to learn later when my brain remembered how to think. That night, the house felt like a museum of a life we'd just toured. I crawled into bed and stared at the ceiling, tracing the hairline crack above the fan, the one Tom had promised to fix in spring. I told myself tomorrow I'd start making my own lists. Thank you cards, change the sheets, water the garden. Tomorrow I'd be useful again. I didn't know tomorrow would be the day Melissa's grief turned into something else, something with edges. And that by week's end, the same girl who called me Mom at the sink would look me in the eye and tell me I had nothing left. The funeral service itself was beautiful in a way that almost felt staged, like a performance Melissa had orchestrated. The chapel smelled of lilies, the kind Tom had always wrinkled his nose at, saying they reminded him too much of hospitals. A choir hummed softly in the background, their voices echoing through the vaulted ceiling. I stood at the front pew, clutching tissues that had long since turned to pulp, trying to hold myself steady as one condolence after another blurred past me. Melissa shined that day, and I don't mean in grief. She was poised, every hair in place, her makeup flawless, her black dress expensive and cut to flatter her figure. She dabbed delicately at her eyes when people hugged her, murmuring, "Thank you," with perfect composure. People whispered about how strong she was, how gracefully she carried herself. I stood beside her like a supporting character in her play, my swollen eyes and trembling lips no match for her elegance. Still, I told myself she was simply coping differently. I'd always been the emotional one, wearing my heart raw and visible. Melissa, I reasoned, had inherited her father's stoicism. Perhaps she needed order and performance to survive her grief. That's what I wanted to believe. But beneath the polished surface, small cracks began to show. While I poured coffee for the cousins in the reception hall afterward, I caught Melissa speaking in a low voice to a woman I didn't recognize. "The life insurance will cover the mortgage for a while," she said, adjusting her bracelet, "and without extra expenses, I'll be just fine." The woman tilted her head. "Extra expenses?" Melissa glanced toward me, then lowered her voice further. "You know." Her eye froze, the coffee pot trembling in my hand. She couldn't mean me, but when the woman's eyes flicked toward me, pity flashing across her face, I knew. My stepdaughter was already calculating her life without me days, hours really, after her father had been laid to rest. I tried to shake it off. People say strange things when they're under pressure, I told myself, but the words clung like burrs, sharp and sticky. Later that evening, when most guests had left, I found myself in Tom's office, straightening frames and gathering sympathy cards. The space smelled faintly of his cologne, that warm cedar scent that lingered even after weeks away. On the desk was a stack of unopened envelopes, insurance paperwork peeking out from beneath. Before I could touch them, Melissa appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing in here?" she asked, her tone sharp, not curious. I blinked, caught off guard. "Just tidying." "I thought—" She crossed the room, snatching the envelopes from the desk and clutching them to her chest. "I'll handle Dad's affairs." He would have wanted me to. "Melissa, Don't worry about it," she interrupted, her lips pressed into a thin smile. "You've done enough." Her words stung. Though she'd said them so casually, she might as well have been commenting on the weather. Still, they left me unsettled. I retreated to the kitchen, busying myself with stacking dishes, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. That night, as I lay awake in the guest room, our room felt too hollow to sleep in. I noticed something else. The pictures in the hallway. Tom and Melissa at her graduation. Tom and Melissa at Christmas. Tom and Melissa on vacation. But the ones of Tom and me? Gone. Every photograph of us together had vanished, as though I'd been quietly erased from the story. The realization chilled me more than the empty bed beside me. At breakfast the next morning, I tried to bridge the widening gap. "Melissa," I said gently, "I know we've never always seen eye to eye, but we both loved your father. Maybe we can—" She didn't look up from her phone. "I'm fine," she replied. "We'll figure things out." "Don't stress yourself." Her dismissal was subtle, almost polite, but it carried the weight of a door being nudged closed. And though I didn't fully understand it yet, that door was about to slam shut, with me on the outside. The confrontation came quicker than I ever could have imagined. It was the evening after the funeral, when the casserole dishes from neighbors still crowded the counters, when condolence cards lay unopened in neat piles, and when my husband's voice still felt like it lingered in the walls. I was in the kitchen, rinsing mugs from the steady stream of visitors, when Melissa walked in. She closed the door behind her with a deliberate click, and when she turned to face me, the softness of a grieving daughter was gone. "We need to talk," she said, her voice clipped, businesslike. I dried my hands on a dish towel and tried to read her expression. "Of course." "What's on your mind?" She crossed her arms, the same stance she used as a teenager when she was about to deliver an ultimatum. But this time, the stakes weren't curfew or car keys. Her gaze was hard, almost unrecognizable. "This house," she began, "is mine now. Dad left it to me. You don't belong here anymore." For a moment, I just stared at her, convinced I'd misheard. "Melissa, this is our home. Your father and I were married, yes," she snapped, cutting me off. "But he was my father first. Everything here, everything he worked for, it should be mine. And I need space to grieve without complications." Complications. That's what I had been reduced to in her eyes. I felt my throat tighten. "I know we've had our differences, but this house is as much a part of me as it is of him. I built this life with your father." She tilted her head, lips curling into something between pity and contempt. "You're a grown woman. You'll figure it out. But you can't stay here. Not anymore." The room seemed to shrink around me. My knees weakened, my palms damp against the dish towel still clutched in my hands. "Where exactly am I supposed to go?" Melissa shrugged, her voice cool and steady. "That's not my problem. You can find an apartment. Or a hotel. People your age move into senior housing all the time." Her casual cruelty sliced deeper than any shouted insult could've. I thought of the sacrifices I'd made, selling my own small house years ago to move in here, using my savings to help with bills when Tom's hours were cut back, cooking meals, folding laundry, filling the gaps that kept this family stitched together. None of it mattered. In Melissa's eyes, I was expendable. Melissa, I loved your father. He would be horrified to hear you talk this way. My voice cracked, but I held her gaze. Her reply was flat, unyielding. Dad's gone. And it's time you accept that the words hit me harder than the news of his death had. At least death had been no one's fault. This, though, this was a choice. She gave me until the next evening. Plenty of time to pack your things, she said, as if she were granting me a favor. I spent that night in a haze, pulling clothes from drawers, folding them into neat piles that blurred through my tears. Every shirt smelled faintly of the man I had lost. Every photograph I wrapped in tissue paper was a reminder of the life I'd been cast out of. At 65, I was suddenly packing like a college student moving out of a dorm, except instead of a future waiting, there was only emptiness. By the following afternoon, my belongings were crammed into 4 suitcases and a few cardboard boxes. I paused in the bedroom doorway one last time. The walls looked bare now, stripped of the family pictures I'd been allowed to keep. The bedspread was smoothed, the surfaces wiped clean. It was as though I'd never lived there at all. At 6 on the dot, Melissa appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "Time's up," she said coldly. We carried the last box to my car in silence. The driveway where Tom once washed the car on Saturdays, where we'd set up folding chairs to watch fireworks, now felt foreign, hostile. As I closed the trunk, I turned to Melissa. I wanted to say something, anything, to pierce the armor she'd built around herself. "Melissa," I said quietly, "I don't know what I did to deserve this. But I hope someday you find peace." Her expression didn't soften. If anything, her eyes hardened further. "You didn't do anything. You just exist. And I don't want you in my way." I swallowed hard, fighting the sting of tears. She had stripped away all pretense, all civility. There was nothing left to salvage between us. I slid into the driver's seat, the unfamiliar weight of exile pressing down on me. As I started the engine, she stood in the driveway, arms folded, watching until my car turned the corner. The house I had called home grew smaller in the rearview mirror until it disappeared altogether. My chest ached, my stomach knotted, and for the first time since Tom's death, I felt not just grief, but something else, something sharp and restless that stirred beneath the sorrow. Melissa thought she had closed the door on me forever. She didn't know the door she had just opened. That first night away from the house, I checked into a modest roadside motel, the kind of place with faded floral bedspreads, buzzing fluorescent lights outside the window, and a faint smell of bleach lingering in the air. The desk clerk didn't ask why a woman my age was renting a room with 2 suitcases and red-rimmed eyes, though I could see the questions written across his face. I was too tired to explain, too hollow to care. The room felt sterile, soulless, like a waiting room for people whose lives had been suspended. I set my suitcases down by the dresser and sank onto the edge of the bed. The mattress squeaked under my weight, and for a moment I stared at my reflection in the mirror opposite me. A woman in her mid-60s looked back, hair mussed, cheeks streaked with tears, eyes swollen and haunted. Was this really me? The wife who once bustled around the kitchen while Tom whistled from his recliner? The woman who loved planting tulips each spring and folding laundry still warm from the dryer? I looked like a stranger. I curled up on the bed and clutched Tom's shirt, one of the few items I had grabbed without thinking. The fabric smelled faintly of him. Aftershave, soap, something uniquely his. I pressed it against my face and sobbed until my chest hurt. My husband was gone, my home ripped from me, and the daughter I had once tucked in with bedtime stories now treated me like a trespasser. Sleep was fitful that night. I woke at every sound, the hum of the ice machine, the muffled voices in the hallway, the slam of car doors outside. Each time, I reached for the empty space beside me before remembering that Tom was gone. The realization hit fresh with every waking. By the second day, I tried to establish some routine. I walked to the diner next door for coffee, forcing myself to eat toast even though grief had stolen my appetite. The waitress, a kind woman with tired eyes, asked where I was from. "Just passing through," I lied. I wasn't ready to confess that I had been locked out of my own home by someone who should have been family. In the afternoons, I scrolled through my phone, aimlessly reading messages of condolence I hadn't yet answered. Friends from church asked if I needed anything, but I couldn't bring myself to reply. How could I explain the humiliation of being discarded like an unwanted piece of furniture? How could I admit that I was homeless, at least for now, because my husband's daughter had deemed me expendable? And yet, beneath the waves of sorrow, something else began to stir. It wasn't anger, not exactly, more like a small ember of defiance. Melissa thought she had stripped me of everything, but she didn't know me as well as she thought. She didn't know the sacrifices I had made, the strength I had forged in years of making do, in weathering storms far worse than spoiled entitlement. One evening, as I sat by the motel window, I remembered a conversation with Tom from years earlier. We'd been sorting through old bills, planning how to stretch his paycheck and my small pension to cover the mortgage. He'd reached across the table, squeezed my hand, and said, "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll always make sure you're taken care of, no matter what." At the time, it sounded like a comfort, a husband's promise spoken in love. But now, in the quiet of that motel room, the memory burned brighter. What if he had meant it? What if he had left something behind that Melissa didn't know about? The thought lodged itself in my mind like a seed. For the first time since his death, I felt a flicker of hope. I opened my suitcase and began sorting my belongings, more methodically this time. 4 suitcases and 2 boxes. That was all my life had been reduced to. But as I folded clothes and lined up toiletries, I realized something. I still had myself, my resilience, my will. And perhaps, if Tom had truly meant what he'd promised, something more. Melissa thought she had written the ending of my story. But deep down, I sensed this was only the beginning of a chapter she never saw coming. The phone on the nightstand rang the next morning. I answered, expecting it to be a wrong number. Instead, a measured male voice introduced himself. "Mrs. Turner, this is Jonathan Miles from Miles and Hardy Law. I handled your husband's legal affairs. I need to inform you of a scheduled will reading next week. Your presence is required." The word rang in my ears long after the call ended. Melissa might think I had nothing left, but something told me Tom had left me far more than she ever imagined. The call from the lawyer came just as my spirit was beginning to fray under the weight of loneliness. I was sitting at the tiny laminate desk in my motel room, a half-empty styrofoam cup of coffee growing cold beside me, scrolling through apartment listings I couldn't afford. Each one seemed like a cruel joke, rents that dwarfed my monthly pension, senior housing wait lists stretching out for years. I was seconds away from closing the laptop in defeat when the phone rang. "Mrs. Turner?" The voice on the other end was calm, steady, almost formal. "This is Jonathan Miles from Miles and Hardy Law. I represented your husband in his personal and financial matters." I straightened instinctively, as though posture could make me braver. Yes, this is she." "I know this is a difficult time," he continued, his tone measured, practiced in the art of speaking to the bereaved. "But I'm calling to inform you that your late husband's will is scheduled for formal reading next Tuesday at 2 o'clock in my office. Your presence is required. The word rang in my ears like church bells. Melissa's mocking voice from that afternoon at the locked door came rushing back. "You have nothing left." And yet here was this man speaking with authority, telling me I was not only included, but necessary. "There must be some mistake," I said, my voice small. "My stepdaughter, Melissa, she told me—" "I can only tell you what the document states, Mrs. Turner," he interrupted gently but firmly. "You are explicitly named as a beneficiary, and your attendance is mandatory. I'll see you next Tuesday." The line clicked off before I could gather another thought. I stared at the phone in my hand, my pulse thudding in my ears. Tom had left me something Melissa didn't know about. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the peeling wallpaper. My mind spun with possibilities. Perhaps it was small, a piece of jewelry, a keepsake, his father's watch. Or maybe it was something more. Tom had always been deliberate, thoughtful. He knew Melissa's temper, her entitlement. He knew the tension between us, even if he rarely addressed it directly. Could he have prepared for this? The days leading up to the will reading were some of the longest of my life. At night, I lay awake in the motel bed, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, my imagination running wild. What had he left me? Would it be enough to stand on my own? Or had I pinned too much hope on a single piece of paper? By Sunday, I decided to gather myself. I went to a department store and bought a modest black dress. Nothing fancy, just clean lines and dignity. I practiced smoothing my hair into place, applying light makeup. I told myself I would walk into that lawyer's office with my head held high, no matter what waited at the end of those pages. On Tuesday, I arrived at Miles and Hardy 20 minutes early, clutching my handbag like armor. The office was paneled in dark wood, the kind that smelled faintly of lemon polish and history. I sat in the waiting room, my heart pounding, and that's when the door opened. Melissa stepped in. She was immaculate, as always, a tailored suit that likely cost more than my entire week's motel bill, her heels clicking confidently across the tile. She spotted me immediately and froze. "What is she doing here?" she demanded of the receptionist, her voice sharp. The young woman glanced nervously between us. "Mrs. Turner is here for the will reading, ma'am." Melissa's laugh was brittle, edged with mockery. "There must be some mistake." My father didn't leave her anything. I felt my cheeks flush, but I forced myself to stay still. Melissa turned back to the receptionist, her voice rising. "Check again." "She's not supposed to be here." Before the poor girl could answer, a door swung open and a man in a gray suit appeared. His hair was silver, his glasses perched low on his nose, his presence commanding but kind. "Miss Turner, Ms. Melissa," he greeted, gesturing us both inside. "Please, come in. Your attendance is required." Melissa's eyes snapped to mine, her smirk icy and full of contempt. "You'll see," she whispered as we followed the lawyer down the hall. "You have nothing left." I didn't reply, not because I agreed, but because for the first time since Tom's death, I wasn't entirely sure she was right. Something deep in my chest told me the truth was about to unravel, and it wouldn't be what Melissa expected. As I stepped into that polished office, I carried every ounce of grief, humiliation, and loneliness with me. But tucked beneath it all was a quiet ember of hope. Tom had promised he'd take care of me, and maybe, just maybe, he had kept his word. The air inside Jonathan Miles' office felt heavy, like a courtroom before the verdict. Dark shelves lined with leather-bound volumes loomed behind his desk, their gold-lettered spines glinting under the lamplight. A framed photograph of him, shaking hands with a judge, sat neatly on a corner table. Everything about the room whispered authority, permanence, exactly the kind of place where truth could no longer be bent to anyone's will. Melissa swept in first, her heels clicking like a drum roll on the hardwood floor. She sank into one of the high-backed chairs across from the desk, crossing her legs and adjusting her jacket as though she were the one presiding over the meeting. I followed quietly, my heart rattling against my ribs, and settled into the chair beside her. Mr. Miles gave us both a courteous nod. "Thank you for coming on time. I know this is not an easy day for either of you." Melissa leaned forward, clasping her manicured hands together, her voice dripping with impatience. "Let's get this over with, shall we? My father's estate is straightforward. I've already been handling the accounts, the mortgage, the bills, everything." She flicked her gaze at me, her lips curving into that cruel little smirk I'd come to recognize. I'm sure she knows she's not entitled to anything. The words landed like darts, but I forced myself to sit still, my fingers knotted together in my lap. I had promised myself I would not give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. Mr. Miles adjusted his glasses, his eyes cool but unreadable. "I'll be reading the will in its entirety," he said firmly. "Every provision will be addressed as your husband, Mr. Turner, intended." Melissa laughed softly, the sound sharp enough to slice. "By all means." But let's be realistic. My father wouldn't have left her anything. She contributed nothing. She was living in his house. Off of him, I turned to look at her then, not with anger, but with something quieter. Sadness. This was the girl whose scraped knees I had once bandaged, whose science projects I had stayed up late helping her glue together, whose tears I had wiped away the night she thought she'd failed her first driver's test. Now she sat beside me, dismissing my life with her father as if it had been nothing more than a boarding arrangement. I opened my mouth to speak, but Mr. Miles raised a hand. "Let's allow the document to speak for itself." Melissa rolled her eyes, settling back into her chair, but her smugness didn't waver. She even chuckled under her breath, whispering just loud enough for me to hear, "You'll see." "You have nothing left." I sat perfectly still, but inside, something shifted. Her words no longer felt like daggers, more like the desperate taunts of someone who had already decided victory was hers. And if I had learned anything from Tom over the years, it was that people who declared victory too early often had the most to lose. Mr. Miles cleared his throat, unfolding the document with deliberate precision. The crisp rustle of the pages seemed louder than it should have been, as though even the paper knew what power it carried. Melissa sat upright, her eyes locked on his lips, ready to savor every word she assumed would validate her reign. I, meanwhile, clasped my trembling hands tighter, bracing myself, because whatever came next, whether small or monumental, it would finally pull the curtain back on Tom's last act of love. And one way or another, Melissa's smirk was not going to last much longer. Mr. Miles began to read, his voice calm and deliberate, each word carrying the weight of Tom's decisions. The first provisions were exactly what I expected. "To my daughter, Melissa Turner," he read, "I leave my personal effects, including my vehicle, and full access to my retirement accounts." Melissa's lips curved upward, her chin lifting higher. She shot me a sideways glance, one eyebrow arched in triumph. Mr. Miles continued, "To my daughter, I also leave the balance of my life insurance policy." Melissa gave a little satisfied exhale, as if the outcome were already sealed. She straightened the hem of her jacket, practically glowing in her assumed victory. I stayed quiet. My heart thudded, but I held on to composure. Tom had been meticulous, deliberate. If there was something he had left me, I knew it would come when Melissa least expected it. "And finally," Mr. Miles said, pausing briefly as he turned the last page, "to my beloved wife, Margaret Turner." Melissa's smirk faltered. "I leave sole ownership of our home and the property at 174 Willow Creek." The words fell into the room like a stone into still water, sending shockwaves through the silence. For a moment, Melissa didn't move. She stared at Mr. Miles as if she hadn't heard him correctly. Then her face flushed crimson. "No," she blurted. "That can't be right." "The house, Dad told me," he said. Mr. Miles adjusted his glasses and met her glare with unshaken calm. "The will is clear, Miss Turner. The deed was revised 8 months ago. The house and all attached property belong solely to Mrs. Turner." Melissa shot to her feet, her chair screeching back across the hardwood floor. "This is a mistake," she shouted, her voice sharp, trembling. "That house is mine. He promised me." I sat frozen, my breath caught in my chest. The house, the very house she had locked me out of, the one she had claimed as hers, was mine. Tom had seen through everything. He had known what might happen, and he had protected me in the one way she could never undo. Melissa's voice cracked as she turned on me. "You," she spat, pointing a trembling finger. "You tricked him. You forced him to change it. You don't deserve it." I finally found my voice, though it trembled as it escaped me. "Melissa, your father knew exactly what he was doing. He loved you, but he loved me too, and he wanted to make sure I was safe." Her face contorted with rage and disbelief. She turned back to Mr. Miles. "I'll contest this. I'll take it to court. There's no way." Mr. Miles folded the papers neatly. "You're entitled to pursue legal action, of course. But your father's will is legally binding. He signed it in my presence and that of 2 witnesses." There is no ambiguity. Melissa's legs seemed to buckle beneath her. She dropped back into the chair, her breaths coming shallow and quick. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale and shaking. For the first time since Tom's passing, she looked less like the triumphant heiress she fancied herself and more like a child whose game had been called. I watched her in silence, my emotions a tangle of grief, vindication, and sorrow. I hadn't wanted this battle. I hadn't wanted to see her brought low, but justice, Tom's justice, had spoken, and it was clear. Melissa had mocked me, told me I had nothing left, but as it turned out, I had the very thing she wanted most, and that truth was more powerful than any words I could have spoken. Melissa's protests filled the room like a storm. Her voice rose and cracked, bouncing off the paneled walls of Mr. Miles's office. No, this isn't happening." She slapped the arm of her chair with her palm, the sharp sound startling even me. "That house is mine. He told me. He said he wanted me to have it. You're all lying." Her breathing grew ragged, her words tumbling out in gasps. "I took care of him. I was there for him. She turned to me, her eyes wild, shining with something I couldn't quite name. Rage, panic, desperation, maybe all 3. "You don't deserve that house. You're nothing without him, nothing." I stayed seated, hands folded in my lap, though my pulse raced like a drum in my ears. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was something heavier, a sorrow that even now I couldn't escape. She was lashing out because she had built her world on expectations, and those expectations had just crumbled like sand beneath her feet. "Melissa," Mr. Miles said evenly, his voice firm but not unkind, "I understand this is difficult, but your father's wishes were very clear. He left the house to his wife. It was his legal right, and he did so in full soundness of mind." She shook her head violently, tears spilling down her cheeks, streaking her perfect makeup. No, he wouldn't do this to me. He wouldn't." Her voice broke into a sob, raw and unpracticed. Then her body slumped back into the chair, her shoulders collapsing as though the very bones had gone out of them. She covered her face with her hands, her sobs shaking the frame of her once proud posture. The collapse wasn't theatrical. It was absolute. I sat frozen, watching her crumble. This was the same young woman who had looked me in the eye on the porch and told me I had nothing left. The same woman who had stood tall at the funeral, poised and polished, already making plans for life insurance and mortgages. And now she sat broken, small, undone by a single truth her father had written into law. There was no satisfaction in it for me, only a strange, bittersweet ache. I remembered the little girl who used to fall asleep in the back seat after long car rides, her head against the window, the hum of the road lulling her to dreams. That little girl was gone. What sat across from me was a woman consumed by entitlement and now stripped bare of it. She lowered her hands slowly, her mascara smeared into dark streaks. Her eyes locked onto mine, blazing with resentment even through her tears. "You don't deserve him. You never did. And you don't deserve what he left. I drew in a long, trembling breath before I answered, my voice quiet but steady. Maybe not. But he thought I did, and that's what matters now. Melissa flinched as though the words were a blow. Her chest heaved, and for a moment I thought she might lash out again. Instead, she sagged further, her head falling into her hands once more. Mr. Miles leaned forward, his expression softened. "Miss Turner," he said gently, "you still have your father's accounts, his vehicle, his insurance. You are not without provision, but the house belongs to your stepmother, and there is nothing that will change that." Her sobs quieted into uneven breaths, the kind that scraped the throat raw. When she finally looked up, her face was pale, her lipstick smudged, her eyes hollow. For the first time since Tom's death, Melissa didn't look like the woman in control. She looked like someone who had lost everything she thought she was entitled to and didn't know who she was without it. The collapse wasn't just physical, it was the collapse of her certainty, her power, her superiority. And watching it, I realized something. She had always underestimated me. She thought grief made me weak, but in truth, grief had made me stronger than she could ever imagine. Tom had seen this day coming, and he had given me the strength and the home to withstand it. The will reading ended in a silence so thick it felt like fog. Mr. Miles neatly gathered the documents, stacking them with deliberate care before sliding them back into a leather folio. His eyes lingered on me, softening just slightly, as though he understood the storm raging beneath my calm exterior. Melissa, however, sat stiff and pale, staring at the polished desk as if she could will the words she'd just heard to rearrange themselves. Her breathing had steadied, but her face was still blotched with tears and fury. The poised, commanding woman who strutted into this office earlier was gone. What remained was someone stripped of armor, a child clutching at a story that had finally been rewritten without her permission. When Mr. Miles dismissed us, I rose slowly, smoothing my skirt with trembling hands. My knees were shaky, but not from fear, from the weight of release. For weeks, I had carried humiliation and displacement like a burden across my shoulders. I had replayed Melissa's words on that porch over and over. "You have nothing left." Now I understood how wrong she was. Tom had seen me. Even when grief told me I was invisible, even when Melissa tried to erase me, he had not forgotten who I was in his life. He had loved me enough to protect me, not just emotionally, but tangibly, with the home we had built together. That deed in my name was more than a legal document. It was proof of his trust, his loyalty, his foresight. It was his last gift to me. Melissa shot up from her chair and stormed toward the door, her heels clicking furiously against the wood floor. She muttered under her breath, venom lacing every word. "You'll regret this." "I'll fight it. This isn't over, but for me, it already was." As we walked out into the bright afternoon sun, the contrast was startling. The sky was impossibly blue, the kind of clear day Tom loved to spend in the yard, tinkering with tools or grilling burgers. For the first time since his death, the air didn't feel suffocating. It felt wide open. Melissa stalked ahead, her phone already in her hand, no doubt preparing to call someone to rage about her so-called injustice. I hung back, clutching my handbag close, not because I needed to protect anything inside, but because it steadied me. On the steps of the law office, I paused. My reflection caught in the glass door. An older woman, yes, weary and worn by loss, but not broken, not defeated. For days, I had been replaying my expulsion from the house, the echo of the lock clicking behind me. I remembered how small I felt sitting on those porch steps, my life reduced to suitcases. Now, standing there in the sunlight, I understood that Melissa's cruelty hadn't defined me. It had revealed her, and Tom, in his quiet wisdom, had ensured that her attempt to erase me would fail. I inhaled deeply, letting the air fill my lungs. The grief was still there. It always would be. but woven into it now was something new: vindication, strength. A sense that I wasn't as powerless as I had been made to believe. I thought of Tom again, his laugh, his steady hand, his promise. "I'll always make sure you're taken care of no matter what." He had kept that promise. Even in death, he had kept it. Melissa reached her car, slamming the door with a force that made heads turn on the street. She peeled out of the parking lot, leaving the faint smell of rubber in her wake. I watched her go, but I didn't follow. For the first time since losing Tom, I wasn't chasing after anyone. I wasn't pleading for understanding, begging for a place to belong. I belonged already. The house was mine. The memories were mine. And the strength to carry both forward, that was mine too. As I turned and walked toward my own car, the sun warming my shoulders, I felt something unexpected stir inside me. Not triumph, not even relief. It was peace. It didn't take long before Melissa came crawling back. Pride had carried her out of the lawyer's office in a whirlwind of fury, but desperation has a way of softening sharp edges, at least on the surface. 3 days later, I heard the knock on the motel door. It was timid at first, almost polite, but when I opened it, there she was. Melissa, in another pristine suit, her makeup carefully reapplied to cover the storm that had passed across her face, at the will reading. She looked smaller now, though, like someone rehearsing humility in front of a mirror and not quite getting it right. "Margaret," she said, using my name for the first time in months. "We need to talk." I stepped aside, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe because part of me still hoped there was a shred of the girl I once mothered somewhere inside her. She sat on the edge of the bed, folding her hands in her lap, staring down at them like a scolded child. "I overreacted," she began, her voice soft. "I was grieving. I didn't mean to push you out like that. It was wrong of me. Dad wouldn't have wanted us fighting." I leaned against the desk, arms crossed, letting her words hang in the air. For once, I didn't rush to soothe or to fill the silence. I wanted her to feel the weight of it. She glanced up at me, her eyes glistening. "You know, this house, it means everything to me. It's where I grew up, where all my memories of Dad live. I can't bear to lose it. Maybe—" She hesitated, calculating. "Maybe we could work something out. We could live there together, or at least share it somehow. You don't want to be alone in such a big place, do you?" There it was. Not remorse, not love, bargaining. I let out a long breath. "Melissa, the day after your father's funeral, you looked me in the eye and told me I had nothing left. You locked me out of my own home. And now, because you didn't get what you wanted, you suddenly remember we're family?" Her face tightened. "I didn't mean those things." I was angry, lost. I shook my head. "No, you meant them. Grief doesn't create cruelty. It reveals it. And you showed me exactly who you are." Her mask cracked then, the polished facade slipping. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't go from everything to nothing. You don't understand what that feels like." My chest ached, but not from sympathy, from clarity. "Oh, Melissa, I understand perfectly. You made me feel that way when you shoved me out of the only home I had, but the difference is I didn't collapse. I found strength in what your father left me, and now I don't owe you anything, not my home, not my forgiveness." Her eyes hardened again, the tears drying as quickly as they'd formed. "So that's it? You're just going to throw me out like I did to you?" I stood tall, my voice steady, calm. "No, I'm not throwing you out. I'm simply refusing to let you back in. There's a difference." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the muffled hum of the motel's air conditioner. Melissa stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. She smoothed her jacket, reassembling her armor. "Fine," she spat, her voice brittle, "but don't think you've won." "You'll regret this." I met her glare without flinching. The only thing I regret is that your father isn't here to see how far you've strayed. He deserved better from you, but he made sure I'd be all right without your approval, and that, Melissa, is something you can't take from me." Her lips trembled, but she said nothing more. She turned on her heel and walked out, the door clicking shut behind her. For a long moment, I just stood there, listening to the echo of her departure. Then I sat down on the bed and closed my eyes. Melissa thought she had the last word, but she didn't. Tom did, and his word was final. The first time I turned the key in the lock after the lawyer's office, my hands trembled. For weeks I had carried the memory of that cruel sound, the bolt sliding shut as Melissa locked me out, her voice declaring I had nothing left. Now the same door opened at my touch. The house was silent when I stepped inside, but not hostile anymore. The air seemed to breathe again, as if it had been waiting for me. Dust motes floated in the late afternoon sun streaming through the living room window. The couch, the pictures, Tom's slippers by the fireplace, it all looked the same, yet everything had changed. I set my bags down just inside the entryway and stood for a long moment, letting the familiarity wash over me. This was my home, my sanctuary, my promise kept. I walked slowly from room to room, trailing my fingers along the walls. In the kitchen, I paused by the counter where Tom used to chop onions, his eyes watering as he teased me for never doing it the right way. In the hallway, I touched the spot on the wall where we had marked Melissa's height as she grew, the faint pencil lines still visible if you knew where to look. In our bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and finally let myself cry. Not out of grief this time, but out of gratitude. Melissa's words, her cruelty, her entitlement, still echoed in my mind, but they no longer held power. She had tried to erase me, but Tom had written me back into the story in ink she could never wash away. He had known her flaws, her bitterness, her greed, and he had made sure I would not be left vulnerable to it. His foresight was love made tangible. In the weeks that followed, I began to reclaim the house, piece by piece. I replaced the flowers in the vases, filled the refrigerator with fresh groceries, and opened the windows to let the spring air rush in. I hung pictures of Tom and me back on the walls, the trips we took, the holidays we celebrated, the quiet mornings we cherished. The house no longer felt like a museum Melissa had curated. It was alive again, ours again. Neighbors stopped by to check in, their faces softening when they saw me back where I belonged. Some had heard whispers of what happened at the lawyer's office, and their nods of approval carried more comfort than I expected. Word spread quickly in small towns, but for once the story was in my favor. Melissa never returned. I suppose her pride wouldn't let her face me again, or maybe she finally understood that she had lost the one battle she thought she'd already won. Either way, her absence was a gift. The house was quiet but not lonely. For the first time in months, I could breathe without fear of being shoved aside. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the living room in gold, I sat by the fireplace with a cup of tea. I thought of Tom, his laugh, his steady hand, his promise whispered across years of marriage. "I'll always take care of you." He had kept it. Even in death, he had kept it. And in that moment, I realized something. The house, the deed, the security, they mattered, yes. But what mattered more was the truth behind them. I was not powerless. I was not forgotten. I was loved, and I was strong enough to stand. Melissa had once told me I had nothing left. She was wrong. I had memories. I had dignity. I had a home filled with love, and I had myself. And that was more than enough to begin again. Sometimes life doesn't end where you think it will. When Tom died, I believed the story of my life had closed, that all I had left was grief and loneliness. Melissa's betrayal seemed to confirm it. Her words, her cruelty, her decision to shove me out as if I were nothing. For a while, I thought she was right. I thought I had nothing left. But standing here now, in the home Tom and I built together, I see things differently. His love was never just in the words he spoke. It was in the way he planned, the way he protected me, even when he wasn't here to hold my hand. That will, that final page with my name written so clearly, was more than a legal document. It was his way of keeping his promise. I'll always make sure you're taken care of. Melissa collapsed under the weight of her own greed, but I didn't. And maybe that's the quiet justice in all of this. She thought locking me out would leave me broken, powerless. Instead, it revealed who she truly was and who I still am. Stronger than I believed, worthy of love and respect, and not as alone as she wanted me to feel. I know the road ahead won't be easy. Grief still wakes me at night, and the bed feels too wide without Tom beside me. But when I look around these walls, our photographs, our memories, I don't feel empty anymore. I feel rooted, grounded, loved. This isn't the ending Melissa planned for me. It's not even the ending I thought I was living toward. It's a beginning, a chance to honor Tom's memory by filling this house with warmth again, by proving that cruelty doesn't get the last word, love does. And if Melissa ever whispers again that I have nothing left, I know exactly what I'll say. I have everything that matters.